Now, the PRO Act. To explain the legislation, please let me introduce Diane Boyle, Senior Vice President of Government Relations, and Mike Hedge, Director of Government Relations. Mike and Diane, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before we get to the PRO Act, I wanted to just share a little bit about why we're doing a legislative update on the Business Impact Week. And I think everyone's well aware that NAIFA advocates on behalf of insurance and financial services industry, the products, the services that you provide. But what you might not recognize is that we also watch out for legislative and regulatory proposals that could impact your business. And so top of that list is the PRO Act, and we'll cover that in a minute. But there's also something with the tax parity for S Corps that we're watching and sort of excited because we have a little bit of good news that we'll share on in just a minute. So if we'll go to the next issue, I'll talk a little bit about that. So the Main Street Tax Certainty Act, if you remember back, there was a concern about during tax reform, the 20% business deductibility and whether it would apply to S Corps and sole proprietors and the like. And so the issue did indeed come up, and NAIFA worked very diligently to make sure that it could apply to some of our members that would qualify. That provision is set to sunset in 2025. And so with it expiring, we want to make sure that it can continue. And so there was bipartisan legislation. Actually, if we could go back a slide, that would be great. Perfect. It's set to expire in 2025. So there was legislation that was introduced that would make it permanent. Now, the challenge is, if we go forward a little bit, we'll talk about the actual tax implication and why it's going to be an uphill battle, but something that we're working for. So as I said, the legislation has been introduced. That's a really good thing. We have some time. It doesn't expire until 2025, but it's something that we try to get ahead of the game on to make sure that we can socialize the legislation and build support for it. The challenge comes in with revenue. The federal government, as you know, is going to be looking to bring revenue into its stolls. All of you have heard me say before, the way that Congress raises revenue or makes any change in revenue is through the tax code. So they have to go through, and there is what the Joint Committee on Taxation puts out, a list of tax expenditures. And what those are is, if those provisions were to change, it would bring in funds to the federal government. And so there's a whole list of them, and we'll have lots more to share on this because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the tax expenditure list that would impact NAIFA products and services. But I want to call out why we had the challenges with the 199A provision in making it permanent. Right now, it shows that it costs the government, if you will, $247 billion. And so there's going to be some concern about continuing that in a permanent factor, and that's what we're working on. But it's those types of provisions that I wanted to bring to your attention and share with you. That's what NAIFA does for you. As we look at how does legislation, regulation impact your business, we go through the tax expenditure list. We look at where Congress may be looking to derive revenue and make sure that we have those conversations to explain the benefit of our industry, how you operate, to legislators so that we can have a favorable outcome. With that, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Mike Hedge, who actually is our lead on the PRO Act, give you an update there, because that's far more into the realm of activity right now, if you will, than some of the tax expenditures that we'll talk about, and need much more time to delve into each one of the provisions that are impacted. With that, Mike.
Good morning. Glad to be here. I'm looking forward to talking about the PRO Act. It's definitely something that I talk about a lot these days. And if you look at what the PRO Act is really setting out to do, could we advance, please? So the gist of the PRO Act is it sets out to redefine what an independent contractor is and what it means to be an independent contractor. There are adverse effects that could impact NAIFA members, both potentially and and technically. And that's one of the reasons NAIFA got involved with the PRO Act originally. And I'm going to talk more about the history and what exactly it does. But it's a legislative piece that's been present at the federal level since the end of 2019. And it originated from a piece of California legislation that passed, and NAIFA was active in that California legislation. And when it came onto the federal side, I went ahead and picked it up in late 2019. We started to look at implications. And obviously, after the last electoral cycle, there were a lot of things that happened in Washington that changed the outlook in terms of the potential success of the PRO Act legislatively and what it would mean to NAIFA members and people working in the insurance industry as a whole. Now, the PRO Act did pass the House upon introduction with a floor vote of 225 to 206. The vote for the PRO Act was very much along partisan lines, with only 5 Republicans crossing over to vote for it and 1 Democrat voting to oppose it. Now, the independent contractor issue applies to both the relationship between the agent or broker and the insurer, as well as the employment situation within the agent or brokerage business. And if there's one thing we're very clear on at NAIFA, it's that between insurers and agents and brokers, the independent contractor relationship is by far the rule, not the exception. And this becomes important as we talk about that later on. Now, we wanted to make sure moving ahead on the advocacy to work with legislators on this legislation, what we needed to do, whether that included opposing the legislation outright, looking for an insurance carve out, which was similar to something we did in California that I'll also get into in just a few minutes. But we went ahead and conducted a NAIFA membership survey. And we have the results here on the screen for you. And if you look at it, 90% of respondents receive income that's reported on a 1090. And that's really where we took a lot of interest in this, because the issue came down to what constitutes a W-2 filer versus a 1099 filer. Also, 94% don't want to be treated as an employee for unionization purposes. And what's important about that is this act is called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. It is a labor influenced and inspired piece of legislation. The labor unions have advocated very strongly for this because they think that the abuse, if in their words, of what constitutes an independent contractor isn't in tune with reality of what an employee actually is. Now, what they said was, they looked at the model of a Lyft or of an Uber or DoorDash, those kind of independent contractor business models where someone's not an employee, they're not necessarily getting a minimum wage, they're not necessarily getting any kind of health benefits, they're working on a contractual basis. And that's what this bill set out to really address. And the primary purpose of the bill from legislators upon introduction was to give more voice to those type of employees. Now, the big issue, of course, is that the insurance industry is a very different animal and a different beast from those kind of business models. The independent contractor relationship, the ability to run your own business while selling the policies for a carrier, is a long established model. And it is the primary modus operandi for the insurance industry. And if you look at these survey results, the ability to set your own schedule, the ability to manage your own business, manage your own time, we didn't have any kind of a clamoring, and I've not seen personally any kind of a clamoring within the insurance producer field where people are saying, we really want the right to unionize. We need to fight for better benefits and that kind of gist. And that's why it's very confusing why insurance producers and people working in the insurance industry, financial advisors, would be lumped in with this very broad and vague generalization of what an independent contractor is and the rights to take away their ability to work is how they see fit. And that's really what it comes down to, is everyone we talked to more or less said, I like what I'm able to do now within my business, and I don't want to lose that ability. To get into the history of the whole path of this legislation and why it's really become much more dramatic over the last couple of years, it started off life as Assembly Bill 5 in the California legislature. And what's always interesting about California is you have in California the country's largest state economy. It is a massive economy. It's one of the largest in the world. And so federal legislators especially on the Democratic side of the aisle, will often look to legislation coming out of the California legislature as kind of a bellwether or a litmus test in terms of what's catching the nation's imagination, what kind of legislation, often progressive, to use that term, is something we could take a hold of at the national level and what's needed at the national level that California is thinking of. Now, in that situation, oftentimes what federal legislators will do is take a piece of very progressive California legislation and moderate it a bit, moderate it, if you will. They take out some of the more progressive aspects, make it more of an appealing agenda item for the entire country. And in that process, you would expect a California legislative piece to become better. In this case, they did not. And I'll tell you why. We worked in California heavily. NAIFA was the primary agent representative working at the California state level. And NAIFA California did a really great job working with our partners, the California Association of Health Underwriters and the Independent Insurance Agents of California. Between the three of us, we lobbied heavily at the state legislature, and legislators agreed that what they were setting out to do legislatively was not applicable to the insurance industry. And because of that, we were actually able to secure an insurance industry carve out. So when the PRO Act went into effect in California, we were exempted. It did not affect our business model. It did not affect how we conducted our business operations on a day-to-day basis. And that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to make sure that our members had the ability to best serve their clients and however they saw fit, and also to manage their business. Now, as the legislation came to Washington, when it was first introduced in the 116th Congress in 2019, there was no carve-out. For whatever reason, when they adopted the carve-out, the language from the bill in California, they did not include the carve-out. And you'll see coming up next, one of the things that was really instituted in the test and what really caused concern for the industry as a whole and raised a lot of red flags initially, and still does right now because of the lack of a carve-out in the federal version, is the ABC test. And as it shows up here in the slide, the test states the worker must be classified and not a contractor unless, and it presents these 3 points, the ABC points. And if you don't meet these 3 points, you are not considered an employee under labor law, under federal labor law and regulation. So you have to meet all 3 of them. And if you look at A and C, okay, that's fine. But B is the real problematic point here. It states that the service is performed outside the usual course of business of the employer. And to really break that down in kind of layman's terms, an example that I've started using, just because it makes sense in my head at least, is if you're Burger King, okay, and you hire someone to deliver your dry cleaning to the restaurant. Burger King is not in the dry cleaning business. They don't operate laundries. Someone bringing you dry cleaning to your Burger King business would be considered an independent contractor under Provision B because the service is performed explicitly outside the usual course of the business of the employer. Now, if Burger King contracted you to sell hamburgers on a roadside stand, that would, by definition of point B, make you an employee of the organization because Burger King is in the business of selling hamburgers. You are now selling hamburgers. In this case, you are an insurance producer. You're a financial advisor. You're offering the policies and coverage of a carrier. You're agreeing to sell that policy on behalf of that carrier. You would be an employee. There's no question about this. And everyone I've talked to on both sides of the aisle, there's full agreement that under the ABC test, an insurance producer who sells a policy for a carrier would be considered an employee. Now, the question is, what does that mean? Proponents of this will argue that you are essentially only being defined as an employee under federal labor regulations and guidelines under the Fair Labor Act. And it modifies that. They'll argue that it doesn't necessarily affect your ability to serve as a 1099 filer. Now, the issue with that is, like a lot of federal legislation, whether something sets out to explicitly define a definition or to more vaguely define a definition, there's often a reevaluation of how that definition is arrived upon. And if you are legally classifying an insurance producer who is a 1099 filer as an employee of the carrier for whom they're selling a policy, then what is to say that in further guidance, whether it's from the Department of Labor on the regulatory side or from another Congress that comes in and says, hey, look, under the federal guidelines of labor relations, these 1099 filers are employees. We might as well just go ahead and take away their status completely, make them W-2 employees, because everyone knows it's only to your benefit if you're forced by the government to give up your filing status and become a W-2 employee. That's the issue when you look at that slippery slope argument and the sliding scale of what defines whom and under what regulation of the government. And that's why the ABC test is absolutely concerning. Moving on to, if you look at, next slide, please. So the path of the House, and this is another problem we encountered, it was introduced in the 116th Congress. And as I said, NAIFA was actually the only agents trade at the federal level that saw this when it came out in 2019 and said, this could be a problem. The difference between then and now was you had a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, and you also had a Republican president. So whatever happened in the House, it wasn't going to have any chance of actually becoming law. And so there wasn't a lot of interest in the PRO Act in the federal Congress amongst DC lobbyists, amongst consumers, amongst producers and agents. Nevertheless, we did a great deal put a great deal of effort into really working with our California federal legislators in Congress, the California members specifically, because this was based on a California state bill. And we worked with them and said, hey, look, in California, your state legislature passed this, and they saw the need to include an insurance carve out. Why don't we have this in the federal language? And what's interesting about the California legislation is it was eventually Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, as one could expect, they spent a lot of money into the tens of millions of dollars to lobby against the legislation because they were some of the primary targets in this legislative piece in California. And the thing is, it went to a court hearing, and the U.S. court in California upheld the legislation. And so what Uber and Lyft did was they actually spent money on a ballot initiative. And in the November election just last year, it was 59% of California voters voted that piece of legislation down. And Lyft and Uber did put some provisions in there and as part of an agreement which established a minimum wage and a per mileage reimbursement. And as you can see, that kind of a model just doesn't apply to the insurance industry. So we're saying up in Washington, why did California recognize the need for an insurance carve out, and yet federal legislators just aren't that interested? Nothing happened in the 116th. Now we find ourselves in the 117th. And when it was reintroduced by Chairman Bobby Scott on the Ed and Labor Committee in the House, the issue with Congress is that if you have a bill that's passed through the House in the previous Congress and it doesn't advance anywhere, there's a methodology where you can reintroduce that bill without sending it to committee in the next Congress and sending it straight to the floor for a floor vote. And that's what happened this time around. And so where normally we would work for, and we had spoken extensively with Democratic legislators in the 116th Congress last year and the year before, and they told us, look, when this bill comes up again, we all know it's not going to go anywhere once it passes the House, if it does pass the House. But once it does come up again, we can work on securing amendments to the language that would allow insurance agents to get that exemption. And so that sounds positive, except because of the way the bill was reintroduced in this Congress, it went straight to the floor. There was no committee markup. There was no committee discussion. It was just sent to the floor for a vote. And that's what Democratic leadership wanted. I was told that they wanted this primarily because they didn't want to give up any provisions. They didn't want to have to negotiate any provisions. They were afraid of too many industries coming up and saying, look, we need an exemption here. and they didn't want to deal with it. And so they took it and they look at it as any aspect. Some of the more progressive members of the caucus, especially those that are labor oriented, they look at it and they say, every time you carve out a piece of this language, it weakens the legislation. And that's, might be true in some cases, it might not be true in some cases. But what they overlook in that situation is the model of the insurance industry. And it is different. It is. You cannot classify us in the same vein as these kind of rideshare companies and how they operate, and whether it's fair or not how they operate or treat their employees or contractors or whatever you want to define them as. The reality is we were able to work with some of our Democratic colleagues in the House and say, we really need this insurance carve out, and without it, it would be disastrous to the industry. I mean, if you're talking about the potential to reclassify, so many 1099 filers in the insurance field to W-2, it's not something they want. And our survey results show that. And we were able to work with 2 Democratic members of Congress to introduce amendments, because the Democrats did allow floor amendments. But the carve out, which was introduced, it didn't get ratified into the bill. And when the bill passed on March 9th, there was no inclusion of that whatsoever. So the carve out was left out. Moving on, the Senate is now the issue, right? And so, lobbying is it's an interesting field because you generally suffer a lot of defeats, but within defeat, there's always the potential for more victory. And that's what we're looking at in this situation. The day after the bill passed the House, NAIFA was ready to send out and mobilize a lot of its grassroots resources to try to educate senators in this issue. And that's the thing, is you're working in this in the House, senators might pay attention to some of this legislation. They might not pay attention to legislation. They've heard of the PRO Act. They don't necessarily know all the intricacies of the PRO Act. And so you continue, because we had been working with senators before as well, but you continue this process of educating members of the US Senate and telling them, look, the House passed this bill. This is what it sets out to do. This is why they passed it. And this is why there wasn't an inclusion of an insurance carve out. And so the strategy moves on to trying to secure that insurance carve out in the Senate. The bill was referred to the committee on March 11th. That's the day after NAIFA began its advocacy in full in terms of the outreach from our membership. And the big question, of course, is, will the Senate actually take this legislation up? And that's something we don't know yet. I was on the phone until yesterday afternoon trying to get a clearer picture, but no one knows anything as of right now. The bill is in committee. It's been referred, but there's no indication at this time whether the committee will take up the bill. Of course, the big issue is the filibuster. And I'm sure many of you have been following the filibuster drama in the Senate, in the news recently. And the issue is there's no clear path or obvious path for the Senate to achieve the vote totals needed to pass this legislation, so long as the filibuster exists. If the Senate filibuster were to be removed and you broke it down to a 51 majority vote, even then, the ability for this piece of legislation to pass the Senate would be difficult. President Joe Biden has already said he would sign this legislation. He is a supporter of it. He has endorsed it. He's tweeted about it. So we know the president is ready to sign the legislation. But when you look at someone like Joe Manchin, for instance, from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, what's great about someone like Senator Manchin is he's a Democrat and he's from West Virginia, which is a very pro-labor state in a lot of areas. Labor unions still have some hold and sway within that state. And yet, being someone who is familiar with the insurance industry, being someone who's familiar with industry practices, that's the type of senator you approach or could potentially approach and say, look, we understand why you would support this bill. We understand why you can't vote against this bill. However, you have to be able to appreciate the need and necessity to actually put in an insurance carve out. And that's what we remain hopeful on. I myself have been on the phone with so many of you over the past couple of weeks, especially since the bill passed the House. The amount of interest that has really grown around this PRO Act, which was kind of dismissed as being fringe legislation or not that important, certainly not important to the insurance industry, has really become the hot topic issue of the moment within the insurance field, just because there is that confusion and the vagueness of that federal legislation that says, well, look, you don't necessarily have to give up your 1099 status, but we are going to legally classify you as an employee, and we'll see what happens as we move along that process. To compound that, the Department of Labor under the Trump administration had put out an independent contractor rule. And in that rule, it was very favorable to our industry. It was something that we supported. We submitted comments on behalf of NAIFA and our membership, and we said this is why this rule should be implemented. Well, the rule was set to be to go into effect in March of this year, and of course, with the new administration coming in, the rule was approved just before the new presidential administration of Joe Biden. When the Biden administration came in, that independent contractor regulation was one of the ones that was frozen for review. And they gave us the opportunity to weigh in, and NAIFA did. We weighed in, we sent in a letter why it should be adopted and why it was good for the business marketplace, why it was good for the insurance industry, and why it was good for our members, giving them the full ability to serve their clients. That rule is not going to take effect, and the Department of Labor under the Biden administration is going to propose its own rule. And all indications at this point are that rule will look very similar to the PRO Act. So you're looking at the Democratic agenda in this, and this isn't, it's not about partisanship in this situation, because it's about education. I don't necessarily agree with the PRO Act. I think there are a lot of flaws in it. I do understand why it was introduced. I understand what it's trying to do. I also understand that it is absolutely ludicrous to try to apply such a general rule to an industry such as ours, which has been operating successfully and without major complaints for such a long period of time. But so we'll be involved in that as well. It seems they're set on some kind of regulation, whether it's regulatory or legislatively, but it really remains to be seen what comes out of that. We continue to work for the carve out, and I can tell you, I know I just said that passage of this bill in the Senate is not likely. However, here's the thing you always have to look at, and I think at NAIFA, we do a really good job of looking at the long game, because what we need to do is we need to try to secure that insurance carve out, even if the bill were not to be heard in the Senate, by including a carve out into any kind of potential language that would come up. This is, if you look at the filibuster issue, they don't have the votes right now on the Democratic side to eliminate it. But if you look at the potential primary challengers in battleground states the Democrats could pick up in the next election of 2022, many of the new candidates who are already declaring for those Democratic primaries are running on an abolish the filibuster regulation or abolish the filibuster rule. And so there's a very good chance that even if this legislation dies in the 117th Congress, it could very well come up again in the next Congress and maybe the next Congress. And so it's important to try to get federal legislators in Washington to understand why that carve out is necessary. So if the legislative proposal does come back, there's that mentality that, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is why we need to do this. This benefits the American public in our opinion. But we realize the only thing it would do is really tear down and revolutionize the insurance industry for all the wrong reasons. It would take away so much of what makes it a good career path for you that work as independent contractors that make 1099 money, to have to try to surrender that for benefits you're not clamoring for, benefits that only stymie the way that you run your business. It's just not something that has long-term positive consequences for the insurance industry. And it really would. I mean, when you look at all the businesses that are potentially affected by this, the insurance industry is one that I think really bears one of the greatest burdens if it were to be enacted, because it would just completely change the model that the insurance industry is based on for so many of the independent producers, the independent agents. And we really want to make sure, if it does come back, that it becomes a part of the Washington mindset that if you're going to introduce this kind of legislation, then you're going to have to include an insurance carve out. That's what we want to do. And that's why we're still targeting the Senate. We're still continuing advocacy, because just because it's not going to pass, or it might not pass, or the possibility of passage is low, you never want to sleep on this kind of issue. And that's why we'll be active in this. I think we'll be active in this until we finally get a carve out, regardless of when that happens, regardless of when this bill is heard. And that's really the most important takeaway and aspect of what we can do from an activist and grassroots way forward in terms of this legislation and the impact it could potentially have on our membership and the entire industry as a whole. And I think one of the great things is we've worked very closely with some of our other partners. And for those of us that were involved with this legislative language in the bill from the very beginning, we sent a letter up to the Hill, to the House side shortly before passage of the bill. And we did a great job, and NAIFA was really pivotal in this role, and all the support that NAIFA provided in getting these other agent trades and other trade associations that play in that field that had not followed the legislation at all. And they were calling me up and saying, hey, look, I know it's like really late in the game, and there's supposed to be a floor vote in a week, but I haven't followed this, and now I'm getting blasted by my members on what we need to do. And we were able to provide those other lobbyists for the industry with resources, with materials, and said, look, this is about unifying the industry. This is about complete opposition to the lack of a carve out. And we need everyone involved and everyone we can get in together on this. And we so many of those partners of ours came in at the 11th hour. And that was such a great boon to us in terms of projecting a unified image to Capitol Hill. And that's something we've continued to do. And in the same way that our grassroots and our membership is so vital, it's working with industry partners and really continuing to, educate, continuing that education. And that's really all you can do. And then hope for the best. That's the life of lobbyist right there. If anyone has any questions, I think I've spoken enough. That was quite a bit of detail on the process and the legislation. If anyone has any questions, I think Diane and I would be glad to answer anything that would come up.
Yeah, and Michael, there have been a number of questions, and first off, both you and Diane, incredible insight and information. We appreciate what you guys are doing on the Hill in coordination with our membership. And I'll just say this, obviously coming from the NAIFA staff side, but for those that are members on this call, thank you for your support. Get involved. For those that are not members that are checking out NAIFA for the first time, it's issues like this that we're really, on top of, and want to make sure that we have the ability to shape legislation favorably for our industry. And we're stronger in numbers. So if there's an opportunity for you to visit our website and join, we encourage you to do so. I'm just going to share a couple questions here. Diane did a good job of trying to answer some of them in the chat as they came up, but for those that weren't reviewing that in real time, we'll ask them again. Mike, do the insurance companies have a plan in place if the legislation passes unchanged?
That's actually a fantastic question. I don't know that I can answer it. So I have gotten a lot of questions especially over the last 2 weeks, with people saying, and I get it, there's been a lot more outreach in this language from everyone, not just NAIFA, but from everyone. And a lot of members are contacting me. They're saying, what's my carrier doing? Are they involved? Like, what is their concern? And a lot of members are actually worried that the carriers aren't even involved. But I can tell you, Diane and I have had good conversations with a number of the companies, of the carriers, and they're actively working this with us. They are concerned, some more than others, which is understandable, but there are carriers that the ABC test in particular scares them. And one of the interesting things about the language, I didn't address this because it doesn't necessarily apply to us so much, but one of the things in the provisions in the bill is that the enforcement or the regulation of whether you're a 1099 filer or a W-2 filer, what your status is with the carrier, doesn't actually fall upon the insurance producer. So my understanding of the language is you wouldn't necessarily face a penalty from the government, a financial penalty from the government, if you were to incorrectly file. However, your perceived supervisor, whatever that means, at the carrier, the company themselves, the carrier would receive monetary punishment from the federal government if they incorrectly identify you. Now, the question is there, how do you do that? It seems baffling to tell the carrier to automatically implement a program that says, we're now going to determine if you're 1099. You might be 1099. You're definitely W-2. This guy might be W-2. That's part of the issue with this legislation as well, is it puts a really strange onus on the carrier. And so the carriers are super concerned. Is there a plan in place? Don't quote me on it, but I doubt it. It's one of those things you do, you plan for the best, you prepare for the worst. I'm sure there are internal discussions going on that side of things. I'm not necessarily privy to them. I haven't heard anything myself, but I can tell you the carriers, they've noticed this. And over the last couple of months, a lot of them have really become actively involved because there is a lot of fear in terms of what this would do, not just to the business model, but put really stringent and difficult enforcement requirements on them themselves.
Excellent. Thank you. Great response. To follow up too, is there, and there's two questions that are kind of similar, and I know Diane did address a little bit here, but as far as the folks on the call, is there a course of action? Is there a language or letters or things that they can do to reach out to their senators? What is our activation plan from NAIFA as far as in coordination? And can you share some light on how the folks on the call and others in the industry can kind of rally together?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you visit, and for those of you that don't regularly, or at least haven't recently, the NAIFA advocacy blog on our website, it really contains a lot of good, up-to-date, up-to-the-minute information. Look at it. There's a lot of state updates that are on there, and so sometimes you have to filter through, to scroll a little bit. But there are a number of blog posts we've put up that have links to so many different resources. One of those resources does contain a link to an action letter that you can send up to your senator. And that's really what we're working on here is, we have carve-out language. It's the same language we pitched. It basically exempts, anyone who's governed by state regulation. That's one of the other arguments we're making is there's always this attempt at federal preemption. It's like whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, it doesn't matter. In my opinion, the insurance industry likes, from my understanding, to be regulated at the state level because it makes more sense. And every once in a while, some federal intervention might be necessary. This is one of those times. It's another federal overreach, in my opinion. It's them trying to seize power away from the states. And so contact your state senator via our platform and let them know, put it on their radar so that at the very least, they understand why we're concerned and what the issues are. And that's really important, is just getting that voice out there. If you have a relationship with your senator, feel free to bring it up next time you talk to them. And if you need resources, you can contact myself directly. I've been providing a lot of resources. There's a lot going on in the issue right now, even though there's kind of a lull right in the Senate. So this is the best time to educate senators. It's not the best time after they've decided to take up a vote on the bill in the committee. But there are a lot of resources on the website, and I'm also available as a resource if anyone wants more detail or wants me to break something down for them.
I won't post your cell, but
my cell is my NAIFA number as well. So I'm conducting all my business exclusively off of my cell phone. So
that's fair. I guess that's a cross we all bear right now.
A little bit of email first, then we'll talk about moving onto the next part of the relationship.
Just for clarification too, obviously we work as NAIFA as an organization with a number of other industry groups. I know a lot of people on the call today are both insurance and securities licensed. Can you share what other groups that we're working with that are more securities based?
Yeah, I mean, we're one of the leaders on this has absolutely been SIFMA. SIFMA played a large role in formulating the carve-out language along with us and ACLI. And the thing about the carve-out language is, and I know that I'm very focused on the insurance side of things, but the securities, there is this carve-out for those registered for securities purposes. That language includes both insurance and securities, especially under governance by state law. So if anyone wants to, I think actually in one of the slides, this recording will be made available after the conclusion. One of the slides actually, I believe I put the carve out in there, a summary of it, and it lists what's carved out there. If you look at California, there were quite a few carve outs, and it touched doctors, dentists. So it is not specific to the point where it's only looking at insurance producers or carve out. Securities folks are involved, and SIFMA has been very helpful and very actively involved. If we, not this slide, but next one. Here we go. It says an employee for purposes of the National Labor Relations Act does not include individuals who are registered with the SEC or a self-regulatory organization or regulated or subject to regulation by a state securities or insurance regulator. So that's the kind of language we went through. And SIFMA has been a fantastic partner throughout this process, working with us and more of the insurance, life and health side. So we're definitely cognizant of that, and we're working, when we present our arguments, we present the entire argument for all of our members.
Excellent. And we've got just a few more, and I apologize, you guys may have touched on this earlier in the session, but just for clarification, if someone has a broker-dealer under the PRO Act, would they become an employee of that BD?
Yes.
Okay.
In terms of the labor regulation, yes, they would be. It definitely affects registered reps of broker dealers. It's all encompassing in that sense. And you'd like to think that Congress would spend more time in terms of looking at the ramifications of individual cases, but it's difficult. I get it. There are a lot of industries out there. That's why it's our duty to ensure. I think the frustrating aspect from the insurance side and the security side is the fact that because they had that carve out in California, all they had to do was copy and paste, right? It's not like it was a new concept. It already existed. California passed the law with the insurance industry carved out. And so why they didn't do that, I can't say exactly, but it is our duty to make sure that they're aware.
Excellent. And I think this might be the last one. It was asked earlier on. Do you have a sense on how this will affect S Corps? Will they have to pass a certain test, or is it down to the individual?
I can't. Diane, do you have an answer on that one? I don't know the specifics of how it would affect the S Corps. I can definitely find that out if Diane doesn't have an answer.
Yeah, no, it's on the individual, but S Corps, I don't think they would still be self-employed. They wouldn't be an employee.
Great.
It's to unionize is what you're looking for. It would give you the right to organize. And I don't know that you can organize as one. But we can dig down further and see how it's impacted the S Corp and sole proprietors as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, everybody, that brings us up to our break. Mike, Diane, fantastic information. Really appreciate all the work that you guys do on behalf of the industry on Capitol Hill and in the state houses. And we appreciate you spending some time with everyone today. I think there was a tremendous value that was given. So for those that are sticking with us, we're really just getting started for the rest of our day. So again, a special thanks to Diane and Michael. This session again is recorded and will be available to all participants and all registrants at the conclusion of the week. And plus Hedge has his email, and we'll get his cell phone out there so you guys can peg him with questions. We'll see you back here in 15 minutes at noon. We're excited to have Ron Lee of Mutual of Omaha to discuss life insurance supplements and the financial plan. Ron and Mutual of Omaha have been a fantastic partner to NAIFA. And this session is also being brought to you by the Society for Financial Service Professionals. We've had an ongoing working relationship with the Society, some brilliant people in their network. And we've had some really great programming that we did, that we had last year. Some was impacted by the pandemic, but we're excited to revamp some of those programs and integrate them in the Business Performance Center this week. And it's really going to be a segue for Advanced Practices Center in a standalone fashion here as we move closer to the end of the year. So really excited to have Ron take a break, stretch, get a cup of coffee, a sandwich, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Thanks very much.